Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to be talking about the Sony A1. Now that it's been out for a few years and can be had for quite a bit less than its original $6,500 MSRP, I thought it'd be interesting to consider if it represents a great value compared to Sony's newer offerings such as the A9 III, the A7R5, and the A7 IV. If you're not familiar with the Sony A1, it's Sony's flagship camera released at the beginning of 2021 featuring a 50 megapixel stacked sensor with the ability to shoot 30 frames per second in RAW format, blackout free. I'll include a link to the full spec sheet in the description below in case you are curious. My opinion is that the A1 is an aging but still current and extremely capable flagship. Although the newer cameras have a beat on a few specific features, until the A1 II comes out, you still can't get super fast, high-resolution cameras anywhere else in Sony's lineup, which makes the A1 an incredible value. As of early 2024, used prices are hovering as low as 40% off the original MSRP, which I think is an amazing deal right now. But I'm certain it'll decrease even further once the A1 II is announced. And just putting this out there for when the Sony A1's successor comes out, I know Sony's going to shock us with some crazy specs on the A1 II, but I still think that the original A1 would be an incredible value at the time for a fraction of the price. By the way, this content is not sponsored and these opinions are my own, using cameras that I paid for with my own money. For more context, I'm a professional portrait and wedding photographer, as well as a travel and landscape photographer while abroad. So much of my opinion is geared toward those categories. If you're similarly a people photographer or even a sports or wildlife photographer, what I have to say may apply to you. If you're a commercial, studio, or flash photographer, you might have a different set of requirements. My primary focus is photography, so while I might mention video, I won't focus on it too much. There are a few key reasons why I believe that the A1 is an incredible value. Firstly, it has a high-resolution, high-speed stacked sensor. You currently can't find this anywhere else in Sony's lineup, and the reason why it's so great for something like natural light portrait photography is that you can have an entirely seamless shooting experience. What I mean by that is that the irony of shooting with cameras with mechanical shutters, i.e. most cameras, is that you are looking at and seeing every moment except the exact moment that you capture. How wild is that? That's because the moment that you captured is blocked by the shutter curtain. With a high-speed stacked sensor, you can completely bypass the situation and have an entirely uninterrupted blackout-free shooting experience through the use of electronic shutter mode. With the Sony A1, you can use the electronic shutter 100% of the time with minimal to no issues, so your experience with shooting one is entirely seamless and you'll actually be able to see every moment that you capture. If I were to compare the experience of using the electronic shutter versus the mechanical shutter, it would be like watching a silky smooth video compared to watching a slideshow. Your experience of shooting will basically be watching a video while taking screenshots. Of course, that's a slightly underwhelming oversimplification of what a photographer does, but it's just an illustration of how seamless and natural it would be. I believe we've all already had this experience with our smartphones, which do not have mechanical shutters and operate only on electronic. Of course, pretty much all mirrorless cameras have a silent electronic shutter mode, but the reality is it's not practical to use if your specific camera model has a slower sensor readout speed. To understand why the Sony A1's electronic shutter experience is unique, it's essential to understand sensor readout speed. Most mirrorless cameras, including the Sony A1, have an electronic rolling shutter, meaning that the data is read out line by line on the sensor until it records the entire frame. Sensor readout speed is different from shutter speed, as this covers the actual amount of time it takes to read each pixel on the sensor, which is determined by how fast your chip's processor and sensor technology are. For the Sony A1, this is very fast and has a negligible impact on your image, so you can use it for pretty much everything. That's actually the impressive part because most digital cameras have a very slow readout speed. The issues pop up when there's a difference in the frame when you start your image capture and when you end it, which means that anything that moves will be negatively affected by slow readout speed. You'll also have moderate to severe banding artifacts when shooting under certain types of artificial lighting as well. When the Sony A1 first came out, I didn't really understand what was so special about that camera and didn't even know about the sensor readout speed spec. After all, you typically won't find this specification on any camera listings. It's only when digging through forums and the back channels that I found the very specs of different cameras when it comes to readout speed. As a result, I had no idea what I was missing out on with my A7R4. After all, my camera at the time had high resolution at 61 megapixels versus the A1's 50 megapixels, Excellent autofocus and eye tracking, more speed than I would ever need, and also had an electronic shutter mode. At the same time, it was also the flagship stills camera that Sony offered at the time. So the A1 would do everything a little better, but so what? Is it worth double the price? I was leaning towards no at the time. Historically, I've never cared for flagship cameras at the $6,000 price point. I even thought that the A7R4 was a splurge compared to the venerable A7 III that I first had in the Sony ecosystem. When I first started my professional photography career through now, I always aimed to own cameras that were excellent value compared to the cost. I started with Nikon because they've always been very generous with higher end features on their mid-tier cameras, a prime example being the D750 DSLR, with its reliability, flagship level autofocus, and tilt screen, which, by the way, almost no other pro level camera had at the time. It's funny because I distinctly remember at the time photographers were scoffing at the ideas of tilt or flip screen, saying, oh, those are for toy cameras only. Real pros would never have a flip screen because they would snap off in an instant. But I digress. I owned a pair of those cameras which cost $2,000 each, which was far cheaper than a single flagship D5 or D6 at $6,500. Granted, I was not a sports or wildlife photographer that requires a particularly high frame rate, voice recording, or connectivity features. There was essentially no benefit for me to splurge on a flagship camera. Yes, you can get a million shutter count and use the camera as a personal defense brick, but it provided me no real benefit to upgrade. The image quality and resolution were about the same, and the overall shooting experience would also be around the same, minus the lack of a tilt screen on the flagship. At the time, perhaps the idea of a camera flagship had a slightly different meaning, prioritizing rugged durability and shooting faster action at the sacrifice of image resolution. Flagship cameras from both Canon and Nikon at the time were limited to 20 megapixels only, even less than some entry-level cameras which had at least 24 megapixels. Fast forward to now, the meaning of flagship has shifted to a machine that can do it all with no compromise: high speed, rugged durability, and high resolution. It's pretty crazy to me how Sony has single-handedly redefined what it means to be a flagship when they first announced the A1. The high-speed stack sensor wasn't a brand new feature. Sony themselves introduced the first pro camera with that feature in 2017 with the A9. But to me, it didn't offer such a vastly improved experience over the mid-tier A7 III, and you couldn't use flash on electronic shutter mode, which to me defeated part of the purpose. And yes, you can use flash on the Sony A1 with electronic shutter, which was pretty mind-blowing when I first learned about that. It took me a while to truly understand how groundbreaking it was to be able to move on to a world beyond mechanical shutters. I rented the A1 a few months after it came out for an evaluation, and I thought it was just okay. Yes, it felt faster and simply worked in every situation, but it wasn't drastically different from my other cameras, so I wasn't convinced. The reason why it felt that way was that I actually kept it on the mechanical shutter for all the events that I was shooting with the A1, having previously had horrible experiences with banding and jello-like effects from my other Sony cameras at the time. I only learned after returning the A1 that this was simply not the way to use the A1. Fast forward a few more months later, I saved up enough to purchase my own, and man, was I ecstatic. As a result of switching to fully silent electronic shooting, I found that it has had an extremely positive impact on my work as a photographer. I felt more connected to each moment, being able to see the exact moment that I want to capture, and capture it extremely quickly and efficiently too. I often take portraits of everyday people, and because they're not models, they often need quite a bit of coaching to be able to show off their best selves. Sometimes these moments are few and far in between, so it helps an absolute ton to have a camera that can be fully silent and rapid fire when necessary to capture the best moments. It also helps that you don't have to draw attention to yourself or make people self-conscious with loud, audible shutter slaps, which is particularly helpful during formal events or ceremonies. It also makes me more assured about the overall longevity of the unit, since all camera manufacturers give you a specific number for expected shutter life. If you're hitting several 100,000 clicks, you might start to get worried for your camera as it approaches this number. This brings me to another reason why I think the Sony A1 is such a great value, which is that it's likely to last you a very long time, especially since you won't be using the mechanical shutter much at all. With fewer moving parts, you'll have a vastly increased lifespan as a result. This is combined with its increased durability through better build quality. When you compare the Sony A1 with the A7 IV, it's about 10% heavier and feels significantly more solid despite being around the same size. When you pick up an A1, it actually feels pretty confidence-inspiring, unlike what you might feel with the A7 IV. On that note, it's also extremely portable. Despite being a flagship level camera with insane performance, this camera won't hold you back at all when you're deciding what to pack. It's basically the smallest and lightest flagship full-frame camera to ever exist. When you're traveling or doing street photography, no one will think that you're hitting them with 30 frames per second raw, especially with that silent shutter feature. Just kidding, please be respectful and don't be an annoying tourist. Some other secondary features that aren't unique to the A1, but when combined with all of its main features, make the camera incredible value include Sony's biggest and highest resolution EVF. This EVF honestly blows everything else out of the water, and while some other companies might be catching up, it remains a wonderful experience to work with and use on a daily basis. It has dual UHS-2 SD and dual CF Express Type A slots, which offer much more flexibility compared to some cameras that only accept one type of card. This is extremely convenient when I use CF Express Type A cards for professional events and switch to SD cards when I'm out traveling, since I don't really want to bring an extra CF Express dongle while traveling. It has reliable GPS tagging through an always-on Bluetooth connection to your phone through the Sony app, which isn't as luxurious as built-in GPS, but I would say with such a compact form factor, I have no complaints. To be honest, the app didn't work that well a few years ago, but recently Sony has stepped up their app development to make this a very seamless and smooth experience. As long as the app is on and a Bluetooth connection is established, the GPS tagging works very reliably and doesn't really drain much battery. It still has a leading high-end autofocus system with lightning-fast and logical responses to anything I want to focus on. It lacks the AI autofocusing chip that Sony now includes with its cameras, but I feel like that's just a cherry on top of an already decadent cake. It shoots 8K 30 and 4K 120, which are pretty solid video specs as well. Because it has a longer expected lifespan and has extremely high stills and video capabilities, I'd say it's quite future-proof. It has incredible speed, accuracy, and high resolution, and everything else you need to capture anything in life. Portraits, weddings, documentaries, sports, wildlife, and landscapes. It's such a capable jack-of-all-trades camera to the extent that I'd be totally happy to keep using this camera for the rest of my life. I've been talking extensively about the things that I like about the Sony A1, primarily because I actually really love this camera, but having the experience of using many other brands and cameras, there are definitely some things that I either don't like about the A1 or just wish could be improved. Firstly, while I think the EVF is unparalleled, the monitor display is probably one of the worst of all the camera brands out there. Nikon, Canon, and Fujifilm all have nicer screens that display images more beautifully than what this camera can do. Granted, Sony screens have vastly improved over the dark A7 III days, especially with the higher priced models such as the A1, but I feel like they still have a little bit of catching up to do with their screens. Can't they just cut up some of their nice OLED TVs and put them in the cameras that are even more expensive than those TVs? Just a thought. JPEGs straight out of camera are also much better than before, but I still like the ones from other brands just a little better. I love Nikon and Canon JPEGs, and Fujifilm also has some wonderfully unique and pretty cool film emulations. After 2020, Sony really stepped up to make their JPEG rendering engine more robust and flexible with nicer looking images straight out of camera. But I'd like to see them match up to the others. If you can't beat them, at least provide something unique like what Fujifilm has done. As a disclaimer for fairness, I haven't done any blind tests or anything, and I spend a lot of time looking at JPEGs through the camera monitor, so I suspect that the part of the reason why I feel this way about the JPEGs has to do with Sony's screens not being quite as nice as the other brands. I also wish that the file sizes could be a little smaller. Using Sony's lossless compressed RAW format, the files end up being around 55 to 60 megabytes, which is not bad, but when I compare them to Nikon RAW files, they're double the size. Of course, you can use smaller RAW formats, but you do lose a little bit of dynamic range and detail in the final images. I also feel like the entire top left side of the camera has a ton of wasted space. Instead of a bulky autofocus mode selector, they could have added another dial for ISO or at least 2 custom function buttons, which given the number of features that this camera has would definitely be way more useful than what they currently have. They could even opt to have a top screen like what the other camera brands have. I'm hoping that the second generation A1 will have a tilting and flipping screen to match their newer cameras, but I'm sure that they will include that in every new camera now. I would also love it if Sony were more proactive with providing timely firmware updates for their flagship. It took them years just for the A1 to get something like focus breathing compensation when the much cheaper A7 IV had that since pretty much the beginning. Every camera or camera brand has some issues that they struggle with, but overall, I quite enjoy being a Sony user, given the high levels of performance and value that they offer, and also including their huge selection of lenses and third-party support. So I also wanted to provide a comparison between the Sony A1 and Sony's newer camera offerings. First up is the A9 III. As of early and mid-2024, you can find A1 cameras for as low as $4,000, which I think is a great value compared to the original retail price of $6,500. It's also a really good value compared to the 24-megapixel $6,000 A9 III. People might be wondering what the difference is between the shutter systems of the A1 and the A9 III. The A1 has an electronic rolling shutter that reads out sensor data line by line, but does it very fast. On the other hand, the A9 III has a global shutter, which reads out everything on the sensor all at once. While that does sound like a big difference, in practice it's only vastly different in a few key scenarios, which may or may not be very important depending on what you shoot. I'd say the primary difference is unlimited flash sync speed on the A9 III versus 1/200th of a second on the A1 or 1/400 if you're using mechanical. If you're a commercial photographer or a portrait photographer who uses a lot of flash, the A9 III might be worth the premium. If you're a sports photographer that shoots in a lot of stadiums with artificial lighting, perhaps the A9 III might be worth it to get rid of the banding effect altogether. I have used the A1 in stadiums on multiple occasions. It's honestly not bad at all compared to other cameras, but when you take a sequence of images, you can somewhat tell that banding is happening. It won't affect your images much since it is pretty minimal, but it will definitely affect your color balance across a sequence of images that you're taking. If you're primarily a natural light photographer, the A9 III might not be a great value, as you probably won't see much of a difference between the A1 and the A9 III in this context. Both are incredibly fast, both to focus and to capture moments. For natural light or wildlife photographers, I'd say that the A1 is a much better value because you also get 50 megapixels instead of 24, which gives you tons of resolutions to work with for large prints or tight crops. Overall, I'd say that the A1 represents a solid value over the A9 III, given how you currently can't find too many used A9 III bodies that are significantly less than the retail price. The A1 is a very balanced camera that offers the best of all worlds and even works well for landscape photography, but the A9 III not so much, as it is even more a specialized tool rather than a jack-of-all-trades camera. Secondly is the A7R5. I actually think that the A7R5 represents an even better value than the A1 with its latest AI autofocus algorithm, improved in-body image stabilization, and multi-directional tilt. It has an even higher resolution at 61 megapixels, which is almost 10,000 pixels on the long edge. If you're shooting landscapes or doing a lot of travel photography, the A7R5 or even the older, cheaper A7R4 might actually be the best picks for you. How I feel though is that after having the experience of 100% shutterless cameras with a blackout-free experience, having mechanical shutters with the curtain blackout and shutter slaps feels like a huge downgrade in experience for me personally. And yes, you can technically use the electronic shutters on the A7R series cameras, but the readout speeds have always been so slow that they're pretty much unusable for anything that's moving and will get very bad banding under certain artificial lighting conditions. Even though I absolutely love the new tilting and flipping screen of the A7R5 and other new features, I don't really see myself giving up the A1 for it. But that's just my opinion, which is philosophically rooted in my frustration at not being able to see the very moment that I capture because of the shutter curtain blocking me. If that doesn't bother you, honestly, the A7R5 is a much better value than the A1. They're about $3,800 new and can be had for quite a bit less used now. Thirdly is the A7 IV. I feel like this camera is actually really good too. Sony cameras are rock solid in general. When it first came out, the A7 IV seemed like a baby version of the A1. It has pretty much all the basic capabilities of the A1 at a fraction of the price. Sony is quite generous with the features that they include with the entry-level full-frame setups. If you are upgrading from an old DSLR or no camera at all, going from that to an A7 IV is going to be much bigger than the difference between the A7 IV and the A1. If you are a studio that requires many cameras to outfit all your photographers, This is probably the smartest way to go. The things you'll be giving up in exchange for the more affordable price point of the A7 IV would be the high-speed stack sensor, the high resolution, build quality, the screen and EVF quality, but that's about all that you're giving up. It is essentially the same excellent autofocus system. It's an excellent choice otherwise, and it's a fraction of the price of the A1. If you're just starting out with the Sony system, the A7 IV is such a good deal. In fact, that's basically how I started in the Sony world with the A7 III. The A7 III, though, had such a terrible screen that I thought all of my photos just were terrible, but I think that was just the screen. But that has been fixed with the Sony A7 IV, so I wouldn't hesitate to recommend that to anyone looking to get into full-frame E-mount. In fact, I'm actually shooting on an A7 IV camera right now. It makes for an excellent YouTube camera in case you're wondering. If you need more speed, you can look at the A9 series, and if you need more resolution, you can look at the A7R series. If you need both, I would look at the Sony A1. It's hard to say if the Sony A1 is absolutely a better value or not compared to Sony's other offerings, simply because they already provide so much great value. But if you want the blackout-free experience in conjunction with high resolution and high speed, it might be hard to look anywhere else. If you don't care about that experience, then maybe you'll find better value elsewhere. In conclusion, the Sony A1 is a unique camera in Sony's product lineup because it offers the highest levels of performance in multiple key categories: speed, resolution, accuracy, image quality, and reliability. Until the A1 II comes out, it still has no competition in having all the desirable features in one camera. Of course, $4,000 is still a hefty amount and there are extremely good alternatives, but if you've been craving that truly blackout-free experience, I think that the $4,000 price point drags it out of the oh hell no $6,500 realm and into the general sphere of oh maybe I can afford that. So now that the camera has depreciated a bit over the years, it might be a good time to get one. Thanks for listening and I'll see you guys next time.